preparing for their mission, Soviet and American crews spent a good deal of time together. In formal mission training, in learning about the other man's culture, in getting to know the man himself.
In the United States, I want to visit Hollywood.
Alexei Leonov, Soyuz commander.
Because I want to be a movie star.
Colonel in the Soviet Air Force.
No, I don't want. Tom Stafford want.
Today, I fact-checked the AI robot machine and I made it apologize. And yes, I do have the receipts. So, if you're a history fan like I am, you might have already heard that this week is the 50th anniversary of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, so obviously I planned on doing an ASTP video. So I was going around reading a few retrospectives in various places, and these articles kept saying the Apollo-Soyuz test project was the final use of the Saturn rocket and the Apollo spacecraft. But that isn't correct. So I went to the Google AI robot machine, which I always do when writing a video. I try to avoid using it as a primary source, but it's really invaluable for filling in background information that might otherwise take many hours to find. So I asked the robot, was the Apollo-Soyuz test project the final use of the Apollo spacecraft? And the robot replied, yes, the Apollo-Soyuz test project in July 1975 was the final time an Apollo spacecraft was used in space. The mission marked the end of the Apollo program and the last crewed U.S. spaceflight until the first launch of the space shuttle on April 12, 1981. And if you're a fan of spaceflight history, I know there are already alarm bells going off in your head because that answer is wildly incorrect. So I asked the obvious follow-up question. Then what the hell did they use for Skylab? And the machine replies, Skylab, America's first space station, was constructed primarily using modified Apollo program hardware. Well, this just gets curiouser and curiouser, doesn't it? I figured at this point it was time to make the robot fall on its sword. And I said, so Apollo-Soyuz was not, in fact, the final use of an Apollo spacecraft, and your first answer was inaccurate. And I got an actual robot mea culpa out of the thing. You are correct to challenge that statement. My apologies for the inaccuracy in the previous response. It's Wednesday, the 16th of July. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. Atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we haven't yet succeeded in building a crossbow so big we can hit the moon, but our maesters remain hard at work trying to solve the problem. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about drinking vodka in space. Actually, no. Let's do a bit more background before we get to the vodka drinking part. And first, just briefly, I didn't relate that anecdote about the AI robot machine just for purposes of self-aggrandizement, maybe a little bit, but I did it also as a real-world cautionary tale about how these things can't be viewed as infallible oracles that know everything about everything, because they're not, and they don't. As we have seen, they can get very basic things quite spectacularly wrong. They are invaluable resources. I use them every day. My research would take drastically longer without them, but just like any other source, they require rigorous criticism and constant fact-checking, and they are not and will never be a substitute for people knowing things. With that having been said, I've never done a dedicated video on the Apollo-Soyuz project. I recall we talked about it a little bit during the Tom Stafford obituary segment we did on the blast radius the day after he died, but for the 50th anniversary, let's give it the proper comprehensive treatment that it deserves. Now, the Apollo lunar missions were the greatest technical and exploratory achievement in the history of the human race. You either understand and appreciate that fact, or you're a crazy person. We flew 24 men to the moon. 12 of them walked on its surface. All returned home safely, but as the 60s were turning into the 1970s, even as the lunar missions were still ongoing, the question turned to what we were going to do afterward. There were many in the Congress, spearheaded by Senator and future Vice President Walter Mondale, who wanted to trash the manned spaceflight program altogether because they wanted to spend the money on welfare and food stamps, because Democrats gonna Democrat, I guess. And they succeeded in getting the last 3 lunar flights canceled, Apollos 18, 19, and 20. Even though the hardware had already been built and procured, the crews had already been assigned, and they were already in the thick of their training. And in its further infinite wisdom, Congress decided we weren't going to use any of this surplus Apollo hardware for our next manned spaceflight program. Instead, we're going to build the stupid, god-awful space shuttle. It's like a pickup truck in space, and it lands like an airplane. It'll be great. How does a goddamn stupid space pickup truck puttering around in low Earth orbit advance the cause of space exploration? Well, it doesn't. But our willingness to do bold things, or even sensible things, it wasn't nearly the same in 1970 as it was in 1960. Eventually, December of 1972 rolls around. Gene Cernan and Jack Schmitt take the last steps on the moon. Apollo 17 comes home. But the other thing that happens around that time is that we start pulling our combat troops out of Vietnam, and that creates a bit of a thaw in our relations with the Soviet Union. So much so that people even start throwing around the word détente. And that gives Nixon an idea. He goes to Kissinger and he says, "Henry, what say we do a joint space mission with the Soviets? We've got all these Saturn rockets and Apollo spacecraft laid around with nothing to do, and if this thing goes right, maybe we could advance the cause of world peace." To which Kissinger says, "Mr. President, I think that's a splendid idea. I'll get right on it." And as luck would have it, the Soviets were more amenable to the idea than anybody expected them to be. They didn't require much convincing at all. So a treaty was quickly concluded that said, yep, American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts are going to conduct a joint space mission in the summer of 1975. But we've only got a couple years in which to bring this thing together, so we better get down to making the crew assignments. The U.S. commander is Thomas P. Stafford, Weatherford, Oklahoma, Brigadier General, U.S. Air Force, Commander, Apollo 10, Commander, Gemini 9A, Pilot, Gemini 6A. He becomes the first general in space on the Apollo-Soyuz flight. The Soviet commander is Alexei Arkapovich Leonov, Lisvyanka, West Siberia, Colonel, Soviet Air Force, first man to walk in space on Voskhod 2. The other 2 seats on the U.S. craft are filled by Vance Brand, Longmont, Colorado, first space flight. He later commanded STS-5, STS-41B, and STS-35, and he is still going strong today at the age of 94 years young. The third seat is Donald K. Slayton, Deke to his friends, Sparta, Wisconsin, 51-year-old rookie astronaut, same age I am now. And if you don't know the Deke Slayton story, he was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, but he never got to fly because he developed a cardiac arrhythmia shortly before he was scheduled to fly the Mercury Atlas 7 flight, and the flight surgeons pulled him from active status. So he got reduced to a desk job, and eventually he becomes the head of the astronaut office. So he is the guy who makes all the crew assignments for the Gemini and Apollo programs. But he still wants to fly, damn it. So he spends the next 15 years cleaning up his lifestyle, exercising his ass off. Eventually, the cardiac issue resolves itself. The flight surgeons return him to active status, and he selects himself to fly third seat on the Apollo-Soyuz project, and nobody begrudged him the right to do that because everybody loves Deke, and they couldn't have been more excited for him. The second seat on the Soyuz, and the Soyuz is only a 2-man craft as opposed to the 3-man Apollo module, is occupied by Valery Nikolaevich Kubasov, Vyazniki Ivanovo Industrial Oblast, veteran of Soyuz 6, later the commander of Soyuz 36, 2-time recipient of the Hero of the Soviet Union Award. And these crews need to spend a hell of a lot of time together in the months leading up to the flight, not just to learn all of the in-flight procedures, not just to travel to each other's countries for press conferences and photo ops and whatnot, but they also need to learn each other's languages. And there is a lot of great footage, which I will attempt to find and put in the video. Leonov and Kubasov wearing 10-gallon hats and cowboy boots as they are experiencing their very first Texas barbecue. And Tom Stafford, he wound up being so hopeless at speaking Russian, his pronunciations were so impenetrable, that Leonov declared him the innovator of an entirely new dialect of the Russian language, which he named Oklahomsky. And by all accounts, Stafford and Leonov thoroughly enjoyed each other's company, and they became great friends for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the engineers are also hard at work trying to make the Soyuz and Apollo spacecraft compatible with each other so they can execute an on-orbit docking and go back and forth between the two vehicles. The Soyuz is designed to be flown mostly remotely from the ground. The cosmonauts are only there in the event of a failure or an emergency. The Apollo, on the other hand, is designed to be flown by the astronauts who are on board in consultation with the ground. The Soviets, they use a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. The Americans use pure oxygen. So there are a lot of things where the engineers need to figure out some sort of happy middle ground. But the biggest point of contention winds up being the docking module assembly. Now, normally, when you dock two spacecraft together, you use a probe and drogue system with, for lack of a better term, a male component and a female component. The probe slides into the drogue, the docking clamps engage, Bob's your uncle, you are docked. Now, this would have been the obvious solution for Apollo-Soyuz, but I think you can probably already tell where this is going. Because neither side wanted to be the vagina. They both wanted to be the penis. Because no matter the country or the culture, boys will be boys. So the compromise they settled on was that both sides would have an identical sort of flower petal looking thing that would open up and fit together, and either craft could be the active or the passive partner in the docking. So it's a bit of an irony, I guess, that male-female penetration was deemed intolerable, so they settled on something that bore more of a resemblance to two lesbians scissoring each other. The Apollo launches from Cape Canaveral on the morning of 15 July. The Soyuz launches from Baikonur Cosmodrome 7.5 hours later, and they effected a flawless lesbian docking on the afternoon of 17 July, U.S. time. It was decided to have the Americans switch temporarily to a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere for the docked portion of the flight, since the Soviets flatly refused to even consider using pure oxygen, which they thought we were fucking crazy for doing, especially after the Apollo 1 tragedy. It takes a couple hours to equalize the atmospheres and the pressures, and then the hatch is duly opened, and Commanders Stafford and Leonov share history's first international outer space handshake. The Americans got a chance to experience eating borscht out of a toothpaste tube, which they politely pretended to enjoy, and then they declined the Soviets' offer of a shot of vodka, for which the Russians laughed at them, as they always have. Drinking alcohol in space has always been on the top of the list of things American astronauts are forbidden to do, but the Russian attitude has always been, dude, we're Russian. Why would we not drink vodka just because we're in space? Now, the two craft remained docked for just under 48 hours. Scientific experiments were conducted. Congratulatory phone calls were had with President Ford and General Secretary Brezhnev. And then it was time to go home. And the only mishap of the flight happens when Vance Brand forgets to shut down the RCS valve during re-entry, so a bunch of nasty toxic fumes got sucked into the capsule. They all had to don their emergency oxygen masks, and all three men spent 2 weeks in the hospital after they splashed down. Now, was the Apollo-Soyuz project a thing that was worth doing? As much as some people tend to scoff at it today, I think yes, it absolutely was. Today, NASA and Roscosmos work closely with each other on a daily basis, managing operations on the International Space Station, and you can't have that kind of cooperation without an initial first step, and in my view, that makes Apollo-Soyuz very much a worthwhile undertaking. And you would have to be a real heartless bastard to not be happy for Deke Slayton. He got to fly in space one time. I am done, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching, see you next time. Get off my lawn.